Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The Arizona sky held a hard blue, the kind that made a man squint until his thoughts narrowed to a single line. Heat shimmered off the flats, bending mesquite and sage into wavering ghosts. Luke Carson had been following a split hoofprint one of his strays when a volley of rifle fire cracked the air like chopping dry kindling. Then silence. Then a single shot, lonely as a church bell. He nudged his dun gelding, Copper, into a lope. As the land rolled toward a low rise, the smell reached him, black powder and trampled creosote. Copper's ears flicked. Luke slowed him to a walk and let the horse pick his footing through a scatter of shale. He found the first sign on the slope, an Army-issue cartridge casing winking in the dirt, then a broken arrow shaft with blue-dyed fletching. Farther on lay a grease-blackened cookpot, spilled beans going to flies. The ground around it was rucked, with hoof marks, some shod, some not circling like a storm had moved through. Beyond the rise, the world fell into a wide bowl. Down there, 5 bodies lay in the bright, pitiless light. 3 cavalrymen sprawled face down in dust, their blue sleeves dark at the elbows. 2 Apache braves lay near the scrub, bodies turned toward each other as if to speak even in death. Vultures hopped in a ring, keeping their distance from the living, a tall man on one knee and 2 women flanking him. Luke recognized the man from 50 paces. Red Hawk, leader of a band that ranged from the dragoons to the high pine, a man Luke had traded horses with one summer and shared coffee with one winter when the snow came fast and foolish. Red Hawk's chest rose and fell in shallow dents. The women were the motion around him, one quick and fiery, the other deliberate as a healer. The fiery one saw Luke first. She rose in a breath, bow half drawn before he could raise a hand. Her eyes were black stones, her posture a question with a blade hidden inside it. The other woman, the quiet one, touched her arm and shook her head. They said something in quick syllables. Luke caught none of it, but felt the sense. Aside fast, he lifted both palms and swung out of the saddle slow. "It's Carson," he said, letting his voice carry but not boom. "Luke Carson. Red Hawk knows me. I've come for the gunfire, not trouble." The quiet woman turned to Red, hawked and bent close. The chief spoke, a rasp with sand in it. She straightened and nodded at Luke to approach. The bow lowered but did not vanish. Up close, the wound was a lesson in how little separates a man from the ghost of a man. The bullet had taken Red Hawk high in the chest, a thumb width below the collarbone, shattering something important on its way out. Blood had soaked his deerskin, dried at the edges, dark and sticky at the center. The quiet woman had cleaned what she could, packed the wound with shredded cloth torn from a cavalry shirt. Luke unslung his canteen and held it near Red Hawk's mouth. The chief drank in small, stubborn swallows. Dust left a white mustache on his lips. He looked from Luke to the fiery woman, and to the quiet one, and something eased in his face. He had decided, too. "Your name still rides with you, Red," Hawk said in a halting English earned from traders and scouts. "Carson." "I'm here," Luke said. He knelt, and Copper nosed the air behind him, patient as a church pew. The quiet woman touched Red Hawk's shoulder and spoke. The chief listened, then nodded. Luke waited. It struck him that waiting patience was sometimes the only decent thing a man could offer to another man's dying. He remembered a winter 4 years back when he had been the one fading. He'd found a creek iced over and misjudged its strength. The dun weight of water, the stars going black in the middle of the day, then hands pulling, a fire kindled fast, a cup of bitter tea pressed to his lips. Red Hawk had squatted across. The flame, eyes reflecting everything and revealing nothing. No payment had been asked, but Luke had left a bay gelding at the edge of the band's camp 3 days later. They had traded smiles across the distance, and a line had been drawn quietly between their names. Now Red Hawk spoke again, and the words fell like stones carefully chosen. Cavalry came this morning. We parleyed until fear spoke through Young. Hands, he coughed. The quiet woman steadied him. My people are gone to the rocks. I stayed. Mistake. His mouth twitched, almost a grin at himself for being mortal. After all, Luke felt the heat press against his back. He sensed the eyes of the fiery woman on him, measuring, weighing. The quiet one worked the bandage with skilled, efficient hands. Without looking up, she said softly, I am Singing Bird. She nodded toward the other. That is Desert Rose. Luke, he said again, uselessly, and looked at Red Hawk, because looking only at the women felt like a trespass in a room. Not his. What can I do? Red Hawk's gaze slid to the women as a father's might. Pride and duty in equal measure, both fierce. He lifted an arm that seemed to float of its own stubbornness, and caught Luke's forearm. The pressure was surprisingly strong. My wives, he said. The word sat heavy in the dust between them. Singing Bird, Desert Rose. His throat worked. I go to our fathers. There are debts that follow me and mouths that speak lies in this land. Men will come with shovels for treasure and rifles for these two. I ask you, take them from here. Guard them. Honor them as I did. He paused, eyes searching Luke's face. Like a map, only if they choose. Singing Bird and Desert Rose exchanged a glance in which an entire marriage spoke. Singing Bird then looked to Luke, chin high. We choose our path, she said. We hear Red Hawk's wish. Desert Rose's bow finally dipped all the way. She studied Luke as one studies a colt, not yet gentle, curious, careful, unwilling to be thrown. We will walk with you until we decide otherwise, she said. If your words are straight and your hands steady, the trail may be long. Luke felt the tug of the world he knew, the ranchers in town who spoke loud and laughed louder, the saloon mirrors that always seemed to be looking back at him, the easy, solitary rhythm of a life built to keep a man from needing anything he could lose. All of that had been a kind of shelter. This would be exposure. But debt moves a man, same as hunger. He had been pulled from a winter creek, warmed by a stranger's fire. Some knots inside a man shouldn't be cut. They should be tied tighter. He squeezed Red Hawk's forearm. I'll do it, he said. Not as property. As people under my word. Red Hawk's breath hitched, either from pain or relief. He tilted his head toward the quiet woman. Singing Bird reached inside a leather pouch and drew out a small bundle. Wrapped in buckskin, she placed it in Red Hawk's palm. He unwrapped it with slow, shaking fingers. A disk of turquoise lay inside, pierced clean through and strung on sinew. Beside it, an eagle feather no longer than Luke's little finger, bound with a strip of red cloth. Red Hawk placed the bundle in Luke's hand and closed Luke's fingers around it with both of his own. Token, he said. Of my word, too. Them, now yours to carry. He glanced at Desert Rose and Singing Bird. Your fire goes on. The land held its breath. A cloud blew its shadow across the basin and moved on. Somewhere, a grasshopper clicked. The vultures stepped in 2 paces and stopped, patient undertakers. Singing Bird's thumb traced a circle above Red Hawk's heart. She began to sing then, not the high keening Luke sometimes heard at camp edges, but something lower, a thread. That might hold a body together a few moments longer. Desert Rose knelt opposite and laid her palm flat over the bandage. Luke bowed his head without being told. Red Hawk's eyes, which had looked past him twice now, as if at something far beyond, returned and settled on Luke. I should tell you a thing, he said, the English arriving in careful pieces. The men who came wore blue, but were not all soldiers. One had a scar and no uniform. He asked for maps. He asked for caves of silver. He said your name once to see if I would betray you. I laughed. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Be ready. The rib cage beneath Luke's forearm trembled and fell quiet. The heat shifted. A wind crossed the basin and put a cool hand on all their necks at once. Singing Bird's song thinned to a thread, then stopped, leaving an ache shaped. Exactly like silence. It did not move him right away. Time needed to have its say. Desert Rose stood first, circling outward in slow, careful steps, reading the ground the way Luke read a ledger. 2 horses left in a hurry, she said, indicating the south trail. With her chin, 1 wounded. They will have fear in their bellies. Fear makes noise. We have a little time. Singing Bird used Red Hawk's own knife to cut strips from his shirt, then wrapped his hands neatly, covering the calluses. She placed the turquoise disc back on his chest, but left the feather in Luke's palm. When she looked up again, there was salt on her cheeks, and dust had glued 1 tear halfway down. We will lay him according to our ways, she said. We will not ask you to do what is not yours to do, but we will ask you to help carry stones. Luke nodded. He had set posts, dug wells, moved an anvil once by brute stupidity. This was a different weight. He and Desert Rose lifted Red Hawk together, as if he might break, and carried him to a cleft of rock at the bowl's edge where the earth rose in shells. Singing Bird laid cedar and sage they had gathered quickly, hands efficient, movements practiced. She spoke soft words Luke couldn't follow and didn't need to. They wrapped Red Hawk in his blanket, left his bow unstrung across his chest, and arranged stones as a fox might arrange leaves over its den, artful, secure, mindful of weather and the eyes of men. When it was done, Desert Rose stood with her hands on her hips and stared south. They will bring others, she said, not to frighten, but to fix the future in place where they could all see it. This scarred man in not blue, he smells like copper and lies. Luke glanced at the turquoise in his fist, then at the feather. He felt their cool and their lightness. He slipped the disc's cord over his head and tucked it under his shirt. He slid the feather into his hatband without ceremony. Ceremony hadn't brought him here. A promise had. Copper can carry 1 more, he said, but not 3. Wheel. Need a travois. There are poles in that broken wagon. He pointed to where the cavalryman's camp had been, now mostly destroyed by panic. We'll lash blankets and make a drag. Desert Rose looked at him, judging, approving, reserving. Judgment again. You know how to work, she said. Good. They moved as a small crew does when the crew knows the sea is about to rise. Singing Bird took what food could be saved and wrapped it. Desert Rose gathered canteens and the most serviceable of the fallen soldiers' gear, a hatchet, a needle, a whetstone, leaving behind rifles and sabers to rest with their men. Luke split the wagon's tongue into 2 poles, trimmed them with his saw, and roped a frame together that would not shake apart on the first mile. He found a scrap of mirror among the cavalrymen, SFX, and handed it to Singing Bird without comment. She tucked it into her pouch as if he had returned a secret to its hiding place. When they were ready, the sun had started its slow fall toward evening. The basin looked ordinary again, which was almost an insult. They paused at the cairn. Singing Bird pressed her palm flat to the topmost stone and closed her eyes. Desert Rose lifted her chin to a hawk circling far above and said something that made the hawk tilt its wing, or maybe it only seemed that way. Luke touched the rock with 2 fingers because it felt wrong to leave without leaving something of himself there. He led Copper by the reins and let Desert Rose take the travois line. Singing Bird walked beside Luke, steps steady, her gaze darting to the horizon, the way a mother's does, even when her hands are empty. They climbed from the basin by a sheep trail that stitched through catclaw and over broken ledges. At the top, Luke paused and looked back. The cairn was a soft hump among harder stones, nothing a man on a fast horse would notice unless told where to aim his eyes. That would have to be enough. They struck north first, not because it was the shortest way to Luke's cabin, but because south was full of shadows with scarred faces. They would swing west with the stars, he decided, cut through a gap only he and deer seemed to use, and make the river by morning. He built the map in his headwater, rock, brush, places to hide if hiding became wisdom. Copper would carry the small pack, and Singing Bird when the footing allowed. Desert Rose would break trail when the ground turned deceitful. Luke would be the hinge that turned their movement into direction dot as they walked. The day cooled from furnace to oven, which counted as mercy in that country. Coyotes lit their lamps in the brush and let their gossip start early. A rabbit broke cover and ran in wobbly arcs that made no sense to a man but perfect sense to a rabbit. They crossed a wash where water had last spoken weeks ago and found a single footprint, fresh as a curse, headed nowhere they wanted to go. Near dusk, they reached a spill of granite worn smooth by wind. They made a small fire that was more for courage than heat, hidden in a hollow. Singing Bird boiled a tin of water and dropped leaves into it that smelled like the underside of a rain cloud. They drank in silence, the kind that fills like a cup. Finally, Desert Rose broke it. "Your town," she said. "Do they spit when we walk?" "Some will," Luke said. He turned his tin cup in his hands. "Some won't. I don't intend to ask their permission." Desert Rose studied him over the rim of her cup. "Words," she said, "are good. Stones are better. We will see which you have more of." Singing Bird gave a soft laugh, the first sound that wasn't duty or grief all day. "He brought stones to our chief," she said, glancing back the way they had come. "That is a beginning." Luke felt something ease in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite surrender. "I'll bring more," he said, and meant it in ways the night would teach him later. They kept the fire small and the conversation smaller, each alone with the part of the day that clung like burrs. When the stars came out, the desert changed. Close, the thorns softened. Distances stretched and stitched in quiet ways. Singing Bird hung then, almost the same song as before, but lighter, as if a thread had been tied instead of held. Desert Rose laid her bow and quiver at her side, and slept with her back to a rock that could not betray her. Luke sat the first. Watch without being asked, Colt across his knees, the turquoise disk warm against his chest. Sometime before midnight, a wind slid over them, smelling of faraway water and nearer trouble. Luke tipped his hat back and looked up. The stars were bright as buckshot. He thought of Red Hawk's hands closing around his, of the feather now riding in his hatband, of the way the word wives had sat like a heavy stone between them all, and how Singing Bird had lifted it into something they could carry. A branch clicked in the dark. Luke's hand slid to his revolver, then paused. A kit fox ghosted along the edge of their hollow, curious eyes glowing for a blink before it vanished. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and felt his mouth tilt at the corner. "Fear makes noise," Red Hawk had said. He would learn its sounds. Dawn would come quick and unforgiving. The scarred man would gather the pieces of his failed hunt and follow. The cavalry would write clean words in a ledger to cover the messy ones in the dirt. The town would judge, because judgment is a habit, not a thought. But that was all the next page. On this page, a man had promised another man he would carry fire forward. Two women had chosen a road that crossed a river and a line drawn by people who owned ink. A chief lay beneath stones he had earned. Over all of it, a hawk circled the pale moon, patient, certain, looking for movement that meant life. Luke adjusted his hat so the feather wouldn't snag and settled deeper into the shadow. Copper breathed slow behind him. Singing birds humming thinned and then folded into sleep. Desert Rose dreamed with her hand still near the bowstring. The night listened, and the desert waited, and the first chapter of the rest of Luke Carson's life began by making room for 3 people around a very small fire. The trail home took 3 days. 3 days of dust and silence, broken only by the shuffle of Copper's hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Singing Bird walked with measured patience, her eyes scanning the horizon as though each cactus or stone might conceal danger. Desert Rose walked ahead, scouting the path like a warrior. Luke rode behind them both, every sense sharpened. The promise he had made to a dying man weighed heavier than the colt on his hip. On the second night, they camped beside the Pecos River. The water was low, just a trickle sliding over smooth rocks, but it was enough for drinking and to cool Copper's legs. Singing Bird prepared a meal of rabbit Desert Rose had caught in a snare, seasoning it with herbs Luke had never tasted. The smoke from their fire curled thinly into the evening sky, and Luke felt a strange stirring in his chest. Comfort. He hadn't known it in a long while, yet his mind circled back to Red Hawk's warning. One had a scar and no uniform. Men who asked questions about silver mines and maps. Luke had no illusions. The trouble wasn't buried with Red Hawk. It was walking, talking, and coming closer every mile. When they reached his cabin, perched near a bend of the Pecos, Luke expected unease. He had lived alone so long that company felt like a new skin. But the cabin, built from cottonwood logs with his own 2 hands, seemed less a fortress of solitude now, and more like a shelter meant to be shared. The women entered without hesitation. Singing Bird examined the hearth, then the shelves with their meager stores of flour and beans. Desert Rose pushed open the shutters, testing the view of the yard and the creek beyond, as if assessing for ambush. Luke stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in his hands. "Ain't much," he said, "but it's dry in the rains, warm in the winter, and the roof don't leak leastways, not unless the wind's from the north." Singing Bird gave him a soft smile, the first he had seen from her. "A home is not walls," she said. "It is the people within." Desert Rose turned from the window, her dark eyes steady. "We will see if this place is strong enough." Whispers in town. It wasn't long before word spread. By the next market day, the folks of Pecos Crossing were talking. The saloon carried the heaviest gossip, as saloons always do. Carson brought back 2 Apache squaws, said Jed Grady, a mule trader with a nose for trouble. Living with M2 out at his cabin. The barkeep spat into a bucket. "Ain't right. A man can keep to himself, but bringing Indians here are womenfolk. No less that'll stir dust." Not all were hostile. Some men respected Luke for his quiet strength, the way he had never cheated a neighbor or backed away from work. But others muttered darkly. The war with the Apache was fresh in their memories. Folks had lost brothers and sons to raids. It didn't matter that Red Hawk had been a leader who tried to hold peace more than war. All that mattered was the sight of 2 proud Apache women living under the roof of a white cowboy. Luke felt the weight of those stares when he rode into town with that Singing Bird to buy supplies. Desert Rose refused to come. Her pride would not allow her to endure their eyes. Singing Bird walked beside him, her gaze steady, her posture regal. She bought needles, flour, and tobacco, as though no one whispered. But Luke saw the way the shopkeeper's wife tightened her mouth when the Apache woman laid down silver coins as they mounted Copper for the ride home. Luke heard someone mutter behind him, "Ain't natural." His jaw clenched, but he kept his hand off the colt. Singing Bird touched his arm lightly. "They are only words," she said. "Words cannot harm us, unless we give them power. A new rhythm back at the cabin. Life settled into rhythm. Luke worked his small herd, mending fences and checking the river water. Singing Bird tended to the hearth, but she was no docile housewife. She rode bareback when she pleased and surprised Luke with her skill at calming skittish colts. Desert. Rose hunted, her bow as quick and sure as any man's rifle. She also insisted on practicing with Luke's spare revolver. Though she scowled at its heavy kick-down at first, Luke felt like a stranger in his own home. The Apache women spoke often in their tongue, laughing softly together. He wondered if they were mocking him. But over time, he realized they were simply carrying their memories into this new life. One evening, after a long day of branding cows, Luke sat on the porch, hat tipped back. Singing Bird brought him a bowl of stew. Desert Rose sat sharpening her knife beside him. "You work like a man with ghosts at his heels?" Desert Rose said suddenly. Luke looked at her. "Maybe I do." She studied him for a long moment. "If you carry Red Hawk's word, then his ghosts are yours too." Singing Bird laid a hand on his arm. "Do not fear. Ghosts only follow those who forget their promises." Luke looked between them. For the first time, he felt the beginnings of something deeper than duty, something like belonging. The shadow of greed, but shadows grew. A ranch hand from Pecos Crossing. Drunk one night in the saloon, let slip that Luke was keeping Red Hawk's women. The tale twisted as it traveled. Soon men were saying the women knew where silver lay hidden in the Apache hills. Jed Crowley, a prospector with a reputation for cruelty, pricked up his ears at that. Scarred down one cheek from a knife fight in Abilene, Crowley was the kind of man who hunted gold with bullets before shovels. He had been seen speaking with soldiers from the fort, men who wore uniforms but looked more like hired guns. By the time word reached Luke's ears, he was sitting on the porch with a pipe, watching the sunset paint the sky. Singing Bird came from the creek, carrying water, her eyes troubled. "A rider passed," she said. "He stared at me long, then rode toward town." Desert Rose stepped from the cabin, bow in hand. "The scarred man is coming. I feel it." Luke tapped ash from his pipe and looked at the women. "Then we best be ready." The promise he had made to Red Hawk had brought them here. Now it was about to be tested. The Pecos night could be cruel in its stillness. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices echoing across the open land, then faded, leaving only the rasp of crickets in the brush. Luke Carson sat on the porch of his cabin, polishing his Colt .45 by lamplight. Singing Bird had gone inside to finish mending a shirt. Desert Rose stood near the edge of the yard, bow strung, her gaze fixed on the line of mesquite that marked the far side of the creek. Something in the air felt wrong. The horses were restless, stamping and blowing hard in the corral. Luke slipped 6 cartridges into the cylinder, spun it once, and snapped it shut. His gut told him the promise he'd made to Red Hawk was about to be tested. The approach, it started with a sound low, steady, like a branch breaking in rhythm. Hoofbeats, more than one horse. Luke doused the lamp and eased into the shadow of the porch beam. Out of the dark rode 6 men, their shapes outlined faintly by moonlight. At their head was Jed Crowley, unmistakable with the scar that split his cheek from ear to chin. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but Luke could feel the man's gaze burning through the night. "Carson." Crowley's voice was raw, soaked in whiskey and arrogance. "We know you've got Red Hawk's women in there. They've got secret silver in the hills, maybe gold. You hand 'em over, and maybe we let you live to drink another day." Inside the cabin, Singing Bird blew out the last candle. Desert Rose had already melted into the shadows by the door. Arrow notched, the bowstring tight against her cheek. Luke stepped forward, the Colt hanging loose at his side but ready. "Ain't happening, Crowley. They're under my word." You? Want them? You'll have to come through me. A ripple of laughter came from Crowley's men. One spat into the dirt. Another cocked his rifle. Crowley leaned forward in his saddle. Don't be a fool, Carson. Apache women ain't worth dying over. Give 'em up, Luke's jaw set. They ain't property. And Red Hawk's word runs through me now. I won't break it. The first shot the silence stretched, broken only by the creak of leather and the restless shifting of horses. Then Desert Rose loosed her arrow. It flew like lightning and struck the man with the rifle square in the chest. He toppled backward with a shout, dead before he hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Crowley roared an order, and the men spurred their horses forward. Luke raised his Colt and fired twice. One man slid from his saddle. The other's horse bolted. Into the night, Singing Bird appeared in the doorway, not with a weapon, but with a long hunting knife, her eyes calm as the moon. "Inside," she called to Luke, but Luke held his ground. He fired again, the flash of the revolver lighting his face for an instant. Another outlaw spun and fell. Crowley's gang was down to 3, but they circled like wolves, firing into the cabin walls, splinters flying. The cabin under siege bullets whined off logs. Desert Rose ducked inside, loosing arrows through narrow slits between the timbers. Each shot was deliberate, precise. One arrow pinned a man's arm to his saddle. His scream carried into the dark. Singing Bird pulled Luke back, just as a bullet tore through the post where he had been standing. She pressed her knife into his hand. "If they come inside, fight like the spirits are watching." Luke reloaded. With steady hands, the metallic clicks loud in the tight silence between shots. "They'll try to burn us out," he muttered. "Dot," and he was right. Crowley shouted for kerosene, and one of his men pulled a bottle from his saddlebag, stuffing a rag in its mouth. But before the firebomb could fly, Desert Rose's arrow cut through the night and struck the bottle in the man's hand. It burst in flame, consuming him in a scream of fire and smoke. His horse bolted, dragging his burning body across the yard. Crowley cursed, his face twisted with rage. Only 2 men remained with him now, their nerve faltering. Luke leaned out the window and shot one from his saddle. That left Crowley and a single outlaw, both snarling like cornered animals. Crowley's rage. Crowley dismounted, crouching behind a trough. "Carson," he bellowed, "you think you can stand against me? I'll cut you down and take them women screaming." The words hit Luke like acid. He felt the fire rise in his chest. He stepped out into the open yard, revolver raised. The moon silvered his face, and his eyes burned like cold iron. "Crowley," he said evenly, "you crossed the wrong line." They fired almost at the same instant. Luke's shot tore through Crowley's shoulder, spinning him into the dust. Crowley's bullet clipped Luke's hat clean off his head, leaving a hot sting on his scalp. The last outlaw turned to run, spurring his horse into the dark. Luke let him go. Fear would carry that man farther than bullets. Crowley writhed in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He spat curses, eyes wild. "You ain't seen the last of me, Carson. Others'll come. They'll keep comin' for the silver. You can't protect 'em forever." Luke walked closer, revolver steady. "Maybe not forever, but I can protect 'em tonight." Crowley's eyes widened. Luke fired once more, and the scarred prospector went still. Aftermath. Yard was quiet except for the crackle of burning brush where the Molotov had spilled. Desert Rose stamped it out with a wet blanket. Singing Bird knelt beside Luke, checking the shallow graze on his scalp. Her hands were gentle, her voice calm. "You stood in the storm," she said. "The spirits will remember." Desert Rose picked up Crowley's rifle and tossed it into the dirt. "More will come. Greed breeds like flies. But tonight we are alive." Luke looked at the bodies scattered in the yard, the blood soaking into Pecos dust. He holstered his Colt, his promise to Red Hawk burning hotter than ever. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "Every night, if we have to." The three of them stood together under the wide, starlit sky. Alone, each had been vulnerable. But now, forged in blood and fire, they were bound by a dying chief's last wish, by the promise of protection, and by the beginning of something neither of them had yet dared to name. The night Crowley died did not end when his body cooled in the Pecos dirt. It lingered like a fever, whispering through the town of Pecos Crossing by dawn. By the time Luke Carson rode in with a wagon load of supplies 2 days later, the whispers had grown teeth. The judgment of town. The saloon's doors swung wide when he tethered Copper outside. Men leaned on posts, spitting tobacco and suspicion. A few offered curt nods. Most just stared. The story had traveled faster than the river. Carson and the Apache women had killed Crowley and half his gang, and now they lived like outlaws under one roof. Sheriff Amos Cutter, a man whose badge had dulled with too many compromises, called Luke into his office. He sat behind his desk, boots propped up, studying Luke with tired eyes. "Word is you dropped Crowley yourself," Cutter said. Luke didn't blink. "Word's true. He came gunning for me. He didn't leave the choice." The sheriff scratched his beard. "Townfolk don't weep for Crowley. He was trouble with boots on, but they'll fret over you keeping them women. Apache wives ain't a thing folks take kindly to." Luke leaned forward, voice steady. "They're under my word. Ain't nobody's business but mine." The sheriff sighed. "Ain't my business neither. Just know you'll always be riding against the grain." Luke tipped his hat and left. He already knew. A home forged in fire back at the cabin, life hardened into routine. They buried Crowley and his men in shallow graves by the creek, unmarked. Singing Bird kept the hearth warm, her quiet presence grounding Luke more than he admitted. Desert Rose kept her bow near the door, always listening, always watching. Seasons rolled on. Spring brought flooding rains that swelled the Pecos until it roared like judgment. Luke and the women lashed the cabin walls with rope and stacked sandbags until their hands bled. They stood shoulder to shoulder against the rising water. And when dawn came, the cabin still stood. Summer baked the land until grass turned brittle and cattle wandered searching for water. Singing Bird showed Luke which desert plants could be, boiled for nourishment. Desert Rose hunted mule deer in the high hills, dragging the meat home across her shoulders. Her pride undiminished. By autumn, a different kind of harvest arrived. Singing Bird bore a son, his eyes dark and steady, his hair thick and black. Desert Rose bore a daughter months later, wild as the desert wind, her laughter sharp as flint. The cabin, once built for one man's solitude, rang with the cries of children and the low murmur of lullabies in Apache tongue. Luke found himself changed in ways a colt could not measure. He rose earlier, worked harder, laughed louder. Nights around the fire carried stories instead of silence. Red Hawk's legacy was no longer a burden. It was a bloodline. The men who came, but Crowley had not lied with his dying breath. Greed breeds. Like flies. More came. First were drifters, sniffing after the rumor of Apache silver. They crept close at night, thinking to scare or steal, but they never left with more than bruises or shallow graves. Luke's revolver was quick, Desert Rose's bow quicker still. Singing Bird, though gentle, proved fierce when her children were threatened. Her knife drew blood more than once. Then came the soldiers. A patrol rode out from Fort Stanton, curious about Crowley's death and rumors of Apache women hiding with a cowboy. The lieutenant was young, proud, and eager to prove himself. He demanded the women be handed over for questioning. Luke stood in the yard, children at his feet, Colt heavy in his hand. Desert Rose and Singing Bird flanked him, weapons ready. The standoff stretched until the lieutenant realized his men were less eager than he was to die over rumor. He retreated. His face, red with shame. The Carson homestead became a name men spoke carefully. No law claimed it. No outlaw dared cross it twice. Some called it cursed. Others blessed. All agreed it was defended by fire. Years down the trail, time is a long rider, and the years passed. The children grew strong under two mothers' teachings and one father's steady hand. The boy, Hawk, rode like his namesake before he could read. A letter. The girl, Rosebud, shot arrows straighter than most grown men by the time she was 12. Neighbors who once muttered came to respect the Carson place. When drought struck, Luke shared water. When outlaws threatened, he rode to defend. Slowly, the whispers faded into stories, and the stories into legend. At night, Luke sometimes sat alone on the porch, pipe glowing in the dark. He'd look to the stars and remember Red Hawk's hand gripping his arm. The promise spoken in dust and blood. He had kept it. He had not just protected the women. He had built a life with them. A family that no bullet, no whisper, no prejudice could erase. The final ride years later, long after Crowley's name had been forgotten, folks still told the tale of Luke Carson. They said he was the cowboy who inherited not just 2 wives, but the legacy of a dying chief. Some swore they saw him riding at dawn, children grown and riding beside him, the Apache women watching from the porch as the sun climbed over the Pecos. Others claimed he fought off one last band of marauders before vanishing into the desert, never to be seen again. But those who truly knew spoke softer. They said what happened after was this: Luke Carson kept his word. He lived, fought, loved, and raised a family in a land that tried to break him. He built something stronger than fear. And when the wind whistled through the mesquite at night, it carried a reminder: promises, once made, can outlast even death.